Let's speak now about the development of the Gilded Age in the industrialized upper Midwest, Midwest, and Northeast. And to begin that conversation, we have to begin with the leading edge of industrialization throughout the era under consideration and throughout the area under consideration, as well as in the South and the West, which is the railroads. The railroads really got started in the 1830s and 1840s, and they pioneered a number of business methods as well as organizational methods that we'll talk about in just a minute. But they experienced a tremendous boom, particularly in the North, during and immediately after the Civil War. They proved their worth to both the North and the South, to both the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War, but they also became part and parcel of the way that Americans and the citizens of particularly the Western world created their nation, especially when they created national markets. Markets required transportation systems. Without transportation systems, heavy transportation, there was no possible way to move the heavy industrial goods that had to be moved in the quantities in which they had to be moved in order to spur manufacturing. So railroad transportation and heavy manufacturing, which were the two great leading edges of the economy of the Gilded Age, then worked hand in hand. The images you see before you on this slide, beginning in the upper left, is an image of a photograph of Jay Gould, who is one of the great railway magnates. Below him is James Hill, who was involved in primarily the Northern Pacific and Burlington Northern railroads. The father of Averell Harriman, Edward Harriman, in the center, who is also a railroad magnate, and probably the most, I hesitate to say the best of the lot, or even the most important of the lot, but certainly one of the most colorful of the lot, and he had his hand in so much more than just railroads, Commodore Vanderbilt, whose steamboat empire, which is where he took the name Commodore from, actually ferried some of the filibusterers to Nicaragua, who attempted to take that country over for the United States in the 1850s. He made his money in steamships, but then, as you can see from this political cartoon, began trying to gather unto himself an empire of railways. It's a natural extension of steamship transportation. Let me reiterate that railroads were the leading edge of American industrialization during the mid and late 19th century. They were the producers of industrial change. By 1900, the United States enjoyed 193,000 miles of track. That's more than in all of Europe. And Europe had some of the most centralized and some of the best railways in the world. But we had a lot more of them. And it was the railways that both opened up a great internal market for American manufacturing and consumer goods, as well as tied the sections of the country more tightly together. They also, railways themselves, were giant consumers of capital goods. They consumed more iron, for example, than any other single industry, both in tracks and in rail cars. They consumed almost more lumber than any other industry, second only to housing. and they consumed more industrial grade lumber than housing did. This was for building of cars as well as laying of track. Let's look at a map. You've seen this map before. Let's look at it again. If you're looking at this in color, and I hope you are, the black lines on the map are routes of railroads built prior to 1870 and in operation in 1870, including the transcontinental line from Omaha, Nebraska to San Francisco. But then those in red are railroads that were built and opened between 1870 and 1890. So you can see the general westward thrust, particularly in this middle section of the West. I'll draw another one of my crude lines around it that tied all of this area together, as well as the transcontinental lines that tied the East and the West together. The railways pioneered new forms of ownership, new forms of financing, and new forms of control. They were the first industry to regularly issue stock to raise capital. Many times a single corporation, a single company would issue stock to raise capital, but because of the enormous needs of capital for these grand projects, these enormous projects, then the railroads commonly issued stock. They were some of the biggest players in the stock exchanges from St. Louis to Chicago to New York to London, as a matter of fact. If the railroad's need for capital, because no single individual had the kind of money necessary to run a railroad, to build it and operate it, because no small group of partners could do that, then the needs of capital for the railroads created the financial sector, which grew by leaps and bounds, and we'll discuss in just a minute. The issuing of stock, which signifies ownership based on amount of investment, then in the railroads meant that they pioneered the separation of ownership from management, which is how corporations work today. Prior to the railroads, and even during the era of the railroads, other corporations frequently had one or two owners, maybe even a small group of owners, at least one of whom managed the concerns of the company. But because of the requirement of significant amounts of capital, because of the requirement for technical expertise, literally in running the railroads, then railroads pioneered the issuing of stock to owners who were not managers, and the employment of managers who might or might not have been owners. There was this divide. In addition, railroads analyzed the business. They hired management and they hired technical experts to run particular components of the business. Into the 20th century, we find, for example, that any hub station would have had a train master who was responsible for moving trains in and out of the station, coordinating the moving. They would have had a yard master, and they would have had a station master. All three of these existed in even small hubs. So when you grow this by an economy of scale, or rather when you scale up, then you find that the business gets broken down into these component parts where no one is really a generalist anymore. Every person employed is some kind of technical expert. They have a fairly narrow focus in their area of knowledge. The railroads, as I alluded to before, also provided a nationwide communication and distribution network. Not just communication because they carried the mail or they carried news back and forth, but in addition to that, the telegraph companies worked with the rail companies to establish telegraph lines. The rail companies needed telegraphs to make sure trains didn't run into each other. And the telegraphs used railway right-of-way to keep their costs down. They didn't have to buy their own separate right-of-way. They could just piggyback onto railroads. So the symbiotic relationship led to the railroads being in the lead of creating this nationwide communication network as well as a nationwide distribution network. Well, let's look at some of the business history of railroads. Now, remember, we're looking from a very much a bird's eye view here. So we're not talking about any particular railroad necessarily, but in general, what are the contours of the business history of railroads between about 1865 and about 1900? Well, there was a major, between 1865 and 1873, there was a major consolidation of railroads. People like Jay Gould and Jay Cook, who had made fortunes in the financial markets of the Civil War, in buying and selling Union bonds during the Civil War, invested heavily in railroads, and particularly Jay Gould and Jay Cook attempted to establish control over railroads. In 1869, for example, there was a huge fight between Gould and 3 or 4 other people, including Commodore Vanderbilt, to seize control of the Erie Railroad that ran from Buffalo, New York to Albany and then down to New York City, following the Erie Canal and the Hudson River. There was a buying spree, you might say, in the same period. Gould got involved with the Union Pacific, as did Harriman a little bit later. So these guys were all hooked into these different railroads at different times. Gould's consolidation of railroads left him with approximately 16,000 miles of track under his control before his company went bust. Harriman, before 1900, had 25,000 miles of track under his control. So to 1873, there was this buying spree, and then there was a crash. It brought on by problems in the bond market, by problems with railroads, by overextension, by the watering of stock. We'll talk about these bad business practices in a moment. But suffice it to say that with the Depression of 1873, railroads broke up. A few of them tried to consolidate again. Some of the longer trunk lines took some of the, shall we say, steam out of the consolidation movement. And the railroads fell kind of prey to both trust making, which is over consolidation, as well as rapacious business practices that left them cutting each other's throats. By the downturn of 1893, then the head of the leading light of the financial sector of the economy, J.P. Morgan, decided that he would take it upon himself to create order out of chaos in the railroad situation, consolidate a number of lines, and then parcel them back out once they were stabilized. He did this by 1898, And until 1906, at least, this stabilized the railroads. They were able to create a modus vivendi that allowed them to live with each other without trying to destroy one another. During this buying spree, and particularly in the immediate aftermath of the buying spree, railroads tried to work together as they consolidated, as they colluded with one another, as they realized the advantages of technology. They did a number of things that allowed them to work more effectively with one another. Some of these things are just straight on technological. For example, they decided to set the gauge at a standard 4 feet 8.5 inches in 1886. The gauge in the South, for example, had been 60 inches. That is how far the tracks are apart. There were some narrow gauge lines in the East and the North that were 4 feet to 4.5 feet. But a train leaving New York at 60 miles an hour traveling west, as the old math problem might say, it doesn't get very far if it's running on 4 feet 8.5 inch track and suddenly has to start running on 4 feet 6 inch track, or 4 foot track, or 5 foot track. It just doesn't work well. And so the railroads of the nation agreed to standardize their gauge at 4 8.5. They standardized their couplings so that cars from one rail line could hook to cars of another rail line. They imposed air brakes, which we're not showing here, which were invented by George Westinghouse. He'll come back up in 1869, which allowed train crews to be smaller and allowed train crews to operate more safely. Brakemen on trains were required to climb to the top of each car and turn a hand crank to slow the wheels down. This meant there had to be a lot of brakemen, and these guys would frequently get pitched from the top of the cars. With the air brake, the engineer could use compressed air to brake the entire train car by car all in one fell swoop, or brakemen could do that from a centralized location rather than having to climb on cars one at a time. Once couplings were standardized, then how did railroads know how much to charge which railroad and which customer for moving cars back and forth? Well, that and just a general agreement led to railroads standardizing billing procedures and accounting procedures, which led to a slow but sure modernization of accountancy and bookkeeping. Finally, one of the most important things that we still have today is the establishment of time zones, which were not imposed by the federal government until later, but were created by the railroads so that they could overcome local timekeeping. Local timekeeping is fine if your reach only stays within a locality, within a single town. But if you have to coordinate the comings and goings of trains, sometimes on the same track, frequently at high speeds, then your job is to keep these things from running into each other. And by creating time zones, the railroad could both set up schedules that were common across the face of the United States, and they could keep trains from running into each other because they had a unified single standard time system. Well, with this kind of power comes the propensity to both collude and cut one another's throats. And the railroads during the Gilded Age were notorious for their predatory business practices. One of the most significant of these was cutthroat price competition, which frequently led to not only beggaring your neighbor, but beggaring yourself, trying to get business so desperately that you sell your product below its cost of manufacturing. Well, you can't, if you're losing money on every transaction, you can't have too many transactions before you run into serious financial difficulties. And the economy was a roller coaster into the 20th century, and shoot, even today, much more of a roller coaster then. So it was very difficult to plan for the future by cutting your prices today. And some cutthroat competition was what led to J.P. Morgan in 1893 jumping in to keep the railroads afloat and to keep them from simply shutting down. The huge need for money, the lack of any kind of financial regulation, the extreme caveat emptor of the financial markets meant that one of the predatory practices that some of the more fraudulent railroaders used was stock watering. That comes from the idea of inflating the weight of your cattle by getting them to drink large quantities of water right before you sell them. But in financial stock, it means to issue more stock than you have assets in the company. It's a mechanism of speculation. I won't go into it too deeply, but suffice it to say, or let me give you the example, that if your railroad has $1 million in assets in stations and trains and things that could be sold at auction, and they're assessed at $1 million. If you issue $2 million worth of stock, you get $2 million in capital, but you've watered the stock by 100%. It's now considered illegal to do that. It's actually a type of fraud. Another predatory business practice that the railroads engaged in, is unfair rate differentials, drawbacks, and rebates. Rate differentials, we might not consider them unfair today. For example, a small farmer who's shipping a few hundred pounds of, or even a few tons of goods, got a kind of the retail rate for shipping his goods. That is, he paid a retail fare, shipping costs. Whereas somebody who bought 100 cars to ship their grain in got a cut rate deal. This favored the large shipper over the smaller shipper and seemed to fly directly into the face of American democracy, at least economic democracy. Rebates are the idea that if you, also known as kickbacks, you make a deal with the railroad company to ship X number of cars over Y distance and Z time, and they give you money back on every car you buy, or every car that you use to ship in. So it makes it a pretty good deal. You're getting a rate differential if you're a big shipper. Then you can demand a rebate. And many of the large manufacturing magnates did exactly that. But furthermore, they would demand drawbacks. Drawbacks are even more insidious. They are a rebate on what your competitor ships. Not a rebate to him, a rebate to you. And one of the great manufacturers who was well known for using the drawback was John D. Rockefeller, who would make deals with the railroads to not only get money back off of the rates that he was getting for shipping his own oil, but if one of his competitors shipped oil, he would get money from their rate paying. Appalling, but completely legal at the time. Also, the railroads would go back and forth between colluding with one another to set prices or to not interfere with each other. Frequently, railroad companies and railroad magnates would conspire. not paying much attention to the laws of fraud, even though those laws were weak. They would engage in monopoly activities, in restraint of trade, and they frequently engaged in out-and-out fraud. For example, the building of the Union Pacific was just fraudulent. It was so fraudulent that it not only rose to the level of somebody having to do something about it, and people were prosecuted, which was very unusual, but also the Union Pacific line in the Transcontinental Railroad, after just a few years, had to be ripped up and replaced because it was not built to specifications, and yet money was paid for a 110-pound track, and 75-pound track was used. There was nobody inspecting it. That's just out-and-out fraud. Well, these kinds of cutthroat business practices and predation led to a demand for regulation, usually by the customers, the smaller customers who were losing out on the railroads. Now, this demand for regulation began first at the state level, but because railroads were interstate entities, then it fled up to the federal level. Small farmers, small businessmen, small manufacturers, all agitated at the state and the federal level for railroad regulation. Eventually, this led to the Interstate Commerce Commission Act of 1887, though the Interstate Commerce Commission didn't have any real teeth until the Hepburn Act of 1906, it still was there to attempt to answer the crying need for some kind of oversight of the worst business practices and overcharging and unfair rates engaged in by the rail companies. Eventually, in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act tried to break up monopolies, but the Supreme Court decided to side on the side, I guess, of corporations, refusing to consider the aspects of Sherman antitrust as applying to interstate commerce, oddly enough, or to manufacturing, usually on technicalities on commerce, and just simply calling manufacturing not commerce, which was legitimate, I guess, at the time. By 1895, Sherman antitrust was dead, except when it was applied to labor unions. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act was foiled in its attempts to stop the worst practices of railroads. But then again, after 1893, where the Sherman Antitrust Act had failed, J.P. Morgan stepped in, and by monopolizing a number of the railroads, he got them to settle down. Then he parted them back out, and they operated fairly effectively until they started rapacious business practices again that had to be curbed in the Hepburn Act of 1906. And then in 1917, they failed miserably to provide for the needs of an expanded military machine as the U.S. geared up for World War I. But that's a whole different story. This is the end of our discussion of railroads in the Gilded Age, and thank you.